Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Claw, Emergence, From the Shadows, by Katie Berry, narrated by Alex Knox. Chapter 1. The Victoria Day long weekend had been sweltering in Red Deer this year, and Caleb Cantrill hadn't expected it to be as hot inside the Bank of Montreal as it currently was, especially not after midnight. Sweat dripped into his eyes as he measured out a length of fuse to affix to the cotton he'd secured around the vault's combination dial with some wax. Figuring 10 seconds worth should be enough, he broke off the remainder of the fuse and placed it into the pocket of his dungarees. An oil lamp was the only light, currently trimmed down as far as it would go and placed on the floor out of sight of the front windows.
"Ain't you done yet?"
asked a gruff, drawling voice from the darkness at his back. It was Albright, a tall man with a short temper. Another voice, this one whiny and nasal, added,
"Yeah, we don't got all night, you know."
That was Albright's second-in-command, Coleman, a skinny little psycho up from Wyoming. He was here to assist with this, the hole-in-the-wall gang's first bank job inside the Dominion of Canada. After almost a dozen years of criminality south of the border, they'd recently decided to expand northward, and a half-dozen of them had been on a recruiting drive throughout the Canadian West. It had been on this drive that Caleb had met up with Albright and Coleman. Just a few days before, he'd received some interesting information from an old associate which he'd bumped into at a local saloon. It had been this same watering hole in which he'd eventually spoken with the Americans over the course of several beers. After a couple of drinks under his belt, he'd inadvertently revealed his interesting information. A shipment of gold, destined for conversion into sovereigns in Great Britain, was going to be moved from the Bank of Montreal in Red Deer sometime after the Victoria Day holiday. Upon hearing this news, Albright and Coleman had decided that absconding with said gold should be the hole-in-the-wall gang's first job in the Great White North, and talked Caleb into coming on board. During his time in Africa with Her Majesty's 5th, fighting the First Boer War, Caleb met numerous Americans, most of whom had been working as hired mercenaries. They were men chasing the freedom that the West had supplied their souls. But with the last golden spike driven into the hard ground of Promontory Pass, Utah, many had seen their dream of adventure and exploration end, and had needed new frontiers to conquer, and that meant Africa. Thanks to his military experience, Caleb had received quite a bit of exposure to explosives, particularly nitroglycerin. He'd been offered a share of the proceeds from the job if he could help them liberate the gold, and although he tried to avoid criminal enterprises whenever he could, desperate times, his constant lack of food and money, had called for desperate measures, and he'd agreed to come on board with them in the capacity of vault man. Turning to his impatient companions, Caleb said over his shoulder, "You can't hurry perfection, my lads." His Irish brogue was quite thick at the moment, thanks to his agitation at the pair of Yanks rushing as delicate an operation as this one. Working with nitroglycerin required attention to detail and a steady hand. But it was typical of the Yanks, though, at least from his experience. In most of his dealings with Americans, they always seemed in such a hurry. And though Caleb was not prone to having a case of the jitters, especially after all these years of using nitroglycerin, he nonetheless didn't need anyone rushing him when in the middle of a delicate operation such as this. With agitation, he added, "We're here to pop this vault's door, not raise this building to the ground around our ears or bring the attention of any coppers in the neighborhood." Coleman asked, "What are you talking about copper for? We're here for the gold." Caleb looked over his shoulder again, this time in agitation, and said, "I mean the bobbies."
"Bobby who?"
Albright asked, clearly befuddled.
"I mean the bleeding police. Are you daft, lads?"
Caleb shook his head and turned back to the task before him. Steadying his hand, he readied to pour the nitroglycerin from the small vial he'd removed from a pocket in his vest. Just as he'd begun the pour, Williams, one of the lookouts who was supposed to be at his post near the front corner of the building, burst energetically through the bank's back entrance, hollering,
"Better make it quick!"
This sudden clamor caused Caleb to jolt slightly. and he ended up pouring out much more nitro than he'd wanted, and he said,
"Damn it all to hell! What's the ruckus?"
The lookout held up a piece of paper with several words scrawled across it as if by a second grader. In a panicked voice, Williams said,
"Red, over in the church bell tower, tossed me down a note."
He rattled the paper for emphasis, then added,
"Said he saw several Northwest mounted police ride into the east side of town just now, over near the Angry Mule Saloon. They must have just gotten back from patrol."
"That's all fine and dandy with your warning and all, but look what you made me go and do."
"What's the matter?" Albright asked.
"I've got way too much nitro on this now,"
he said, pointing over his shoulder toward the explosive-soaked cotton on the vault's dial at his back.
"What's the matter? Won't it work?"
Coleman asked.
"Oh, it'll work all right. Maybe a little too well,"
Caleb said with a sad shake of his head.
"Can't you take some of it out?"
Albright wondered.
"You go right ahead and try to wring the nitro from that cotton batten, my friend. While you do that, I'll be standing outside in the alley on the other side of that brick wall."
"Well, there's no turning back now," Albright said tersely.
"Aye, you're right about that. I guess whatever will be, will be."
"Let's do it then," Albright said, nodding to his henchmen. The trio of Americans retreated from the vault and moved toward the back of the room. Seeing they were clear, Caleb withdrew a matchstick from the brass match safe in his pocket, lit the fuse, and then hustled toward the men's location. He moved quickly past them, saying,
"I wasn't kidding about being on the other side of this brick wall."
With that, he stepped out into the alley and was promptly followed by the rest of the gang. Coleman, the scrawny Yank, was the last one out. With an exasperated sigh, Caleb pushed the door shut that the man had left open at his back. Mentally counting down, with about 4 seconds left, he was startled to see Coleman standing across the alley from the steel door, a door behind which a substantial amount of nitroglycerin was about to detonate. Not wanting to have someone injured on his watch, Caleb tugged the thin man away from the door by the shirt sleeve. The American was about to say something and attempted to draw away from Caleb's grasp when the nitro went off with a bang inside the bank. The bank's heavy steel door blew across the alley and slammed into the wooden siding of a lawyer's office next door. It stood upright for a moment, then fell forward and hit the ground with a crash. Behind it, an imprint of the door lay a half-inch deep into the wood. Coleman looked at it wide-eyed, then back at Caleb, and nodded his head in thanks, saying,
"Much obliged." "Don't mention it," Caleb said. "I didn't want to see you turned into a pancake."
He looked to the other men and said seriously,
"Now that every copper in Red Deer has been alerted to our midnight misappropriations, perhaps we should get a move on."
As the words came out of his mouth, the Americans were already bustling back into the bank. Caleb followed closely behind them, and they parted as he approached so that he could see the result of his handiwork. Caleb shook his head wonderingly and said,
My, that seems to have worked."
Scorched and blackened, the vault door hung from one hinge, and there was now a hole where the combination dial had been. Smoke and dust hung in the air, and Caleb sneezed. All the windows along the front of the bank now lay in millions of fragments out in the street. Overhead, the ceiling had a rather alarmingly large crack down the middle. His wonderment at the result of the explosion now abated, Albright said,
"Get at it."
The man rushed to the vault and began grabbing the sacks of gold within. In addition to the full bags, many more had been damaged in the blast, and small golden ingots lay scattered across the vault floor. They gleamed enticingly, looking to be pure gold, with the words 999.99 fine stamped on them. Coleman thrust an armload at Caleb. He held them awkwardly and staggered out the door to the horses secured along the alleyway, away from the explosion. Marveling at the 4 bags in his arms, Caleb realized his share would supply his needs for many months, or perhaps years to come. His horse, an old nag he'd liberated from a farm near Medicine Hat, waited impatiently, wanting to be away from this place and all its noise and commotion as soon as possible. After securing the sacks to his horse, he returned to the bank. Albright was just coming out the door with another armful of gold, which he thrust into Caleb's arms, then returned to the bank to collect more.
"Thank you, lad," Caleb said with a grin. He glanced inside and saw the men were now busy trying to gather up the remaining pieces of gold ingots that had been freed from their sacks in the blast. Leaving the men to their work, Caleb wobbled toward his horse under another load of gold. After cinching up 3 more sacks from his current armful to his horse, he figured that was all the aged animal could bear. With a sigh, he secured the final bag to one of the other horses. It was at that moment he heard the first gunshot, and then the many more that followed. "That's got to be those northwest bobbies barking at the door," Caleb said to his horse, and the animal snorted in seeming agreement. He mounted it and quickly galloped back to the bank's rear door. Leaping from the horse, he peeked inside. Judging by the racket of gunfire, it seemed there was more than just a few members of the law out front. A barrage of bullets tore into the bank from the darkened street outside, pinning the Americans down. Caleb, however, wasn't about to jump into the fray, guns blazing. Number 1, it wasn't his fight, and number 2, he didn't own a gun. During his time in Her Majesty's 5th, Caleb had seen a lot of horrors, especially horrors created by guns that had been used on human beings, and he'd avoided the noisy things whenever he could, unless it was absolutely necessary. In his estimation, this current outbreak of flying lead was not one of those times. Since this was neither his circus nor his monkeys, he decided that his absence, though it wouldn't make his heart grow fonder, would at least allow it to continue beating in his chest, the further he was away from any errant bullets. With those thoughts racing through his head, Caleb leapt back onto his mount. About to spur the nag down the alley to freedom, a groaning noise came at his back, unlike anything he'd ever heard. It wasn't a person, but instead seemed the building itself, and it was now in its death throes. Weakened by the nitroglycerin's explosion and the hot lead peppering everything in sight, the structure seemed to cry out in anguish as the remaining timbers supporting its upper floors gave their last hurrah, and it began to collapse inward on itself. Shouting, "Hyah!" Caleb pointed the horse back the way they'd come. The nag seemed suddenly enlivened, perhaps also sensing the danger of the collapsing building. Together, they shot down the alley and into the night. With a wondering shake of his head, Caleb realized that he was at least fortunate enough to have his freedom for the moment, and plenty of gold with which to enjoy it. If he lived long enough to do so, that was. He was well aware that the hole-in-the-wall gang would be looking for him after this recent debacle, and he was also fairly sure they wouldn't accept his explanation for fleeing with most of the gold. He supposed he could always say he'd wanted to keep the riches safe from other ne'er-do-wells so that it could be properly shared later. But he was pretty sure they wouldn't buy it, and the reality was that if they ever found him, they'd probably shoot first and ask questions later. But that was something he would worry about in the future. Right now, he needed to find somewhere to lay low for a little while, and the lower, the better. Chapter 2. Near the bottom of the short slope, the bald-headed man struggled against the dirt packed tightly around his neck. He thrashed his head back and forth, trying to wriggle out of the narrow hole in which he'd been buried. But it was a futile attempt, since he had been interred standing upright, his arms at his sides, the earth holding him firmly in its cement-like grip. Wheezing from the pressure of the dirt, compacting more and more around his chest with each shallow breath, he said,
"Listen, I told you, I don't have them, honest."
With a slow shuffle, Jesus Oritz walked around the man in diminishing circles, tamping down loose soil as he went. He continued around his captive's head until his booted toes were within inches of the man's face, and then he said, "You would not believe how many men suddenly become honest when they find themselves in a place such as yours." The man craned his head to look up at Oritz, who now towered over him.
What do you mean? I really don't know where they are. Vargas took them, and he's probably halfway to Tijuana by now."
Oritz removed a thin silver canister from the interior pocket of his duster. He popped the top off, extracted a slender browned cigarillo from one side and a match from the other, and then placed the canister back in his pocket. Crouching, Jesus said, "Tijuana is an awfully long way from Montana."
He raked the match across his captive's beard stubble, and the man cried out in pain. Jesus smiled slightly, several of his yellow teeth briefly visible through his thinly parted lips. He cupped his hands around the match so that the hot, dry wind wouldn't blow it out, then touched the flaring tip to the end of his cigarillo and inhaled deeply. A red welt blossoming on his cheek, the man in the ground said,
"Listen, I'm telling you the truth."
"Strange thing about the truth. Sometimes it can come back to bite you on the ass when you least expect it." After another deep drag on the cigarillo, Oritz blew smoke into his captive's face, making him cough. Jesus stood, then flicked the match at a large hill of ants about a dozen feet away. Though only a slight stub, when the slender piece of flaming wood hit the small red creatures, they scrambled over it, roasting themselves alive as they attempted to extinguish the burning intruder. For a moment, the man craned his neck to look at the ants, then tore his frightened gaze away and looked up at his captor once more, saying,
"What do you mean, come back to bite me?"
"Your friend, Vargas, he found the truth, and it bit him." Oritz smiled again, this time broadly, gold filling sparkling brilliantly from each corner of his mouth. "Like many men before him, he learned the hard truth that you don't steal from the hole-in-the-wall gang and live."
"I told you, he took them all."
"And you are sure of that?"
"Yes, he cold-cocked me after the job and disappeared."
"Well, the sad truth, for you at least, is that he only had half of the proceeds when we found him in Billings." Sweat dripping into his eyes, the man said,
"He must have buried the other half someplace, because he knew it would make me look guilty if you ever found me."
"Funny, that's what Vargas said you'd say. But you know what I think? I think you split them with him and then parted ways, hoping we'd never find you." Oritz slowly circled his prisoner several more times, his spurs jingling musically as he walked. He tapped some ash from the end of his cigarillo onto the man's exposed head. "And as you see, Ellis, we did indeed find you, and you certainly look guilty to me."
"I don't have them! I swear!"
Ellis shook the ash off his head and squirmed in the dirt as if trying to summon some superhuman strength and free himself from his vertical grave. Smiling again, Jesus said, "I am sure you will be more than willing to tell me where we can find the rest of the proceeds very soon."
"But I am talking, and I told you I don't have them."
"Okay, if that is what you wish." From another pocket in his duster, Oritz removed a small glass bottle filled with amber fluid. He held the bottle up to the brilliant sun overhead and examined it for a moment. The intense light shining through the clear glass painted his tanned face in a golden hue. "This is very expensive honey, and it is a shame to waste it. But sometimes the job a man does necessitates certain hardships." Shaking his head sadly, Jesus popped the cork from the bottle, poured a thin trickle of the viscous golden fluid onto one of his grimy fingertips, and licked it clean. He smacked his lips appreciatively for a moment, then shook his head again. "Such a waste." With a sigh, he proceeded to pour some of the bottle's contents onto the man's shining, hairless head. As he did, his apparent sadness at such extravagance dissipated, and Jesus laughed as the honey dribbled down into his prisoner's ears, eyes, and mouth. Ellis gagged and spat, then blinked several times as he attempted to get his eyelids unstuck. He eventually succeeded, but discovered Oritz had disappeared from view and looked wildly about for a moment. When he located Jesus, his already alarmed eyes widened even further. Mounting panic filled his voice as he called out,
All right, I'll talk."
Puffing on his cigarillo like a locomotive, Oritz was halfway to the sizable anthill. A thin trail of honey lay in the dirt behind him, his bottle now more than half empty. He took a final drag on his cigarillo, the end glowing brightly despite the sun's blinding intensity, then flicked it directly into the roiling mass of insects. Like the match before it, the ants swarmed the enemy, smothering it with their bodies in order to save the colony. Jesus watched the drama unfold for a moment, seeming amused by the small creatures immolating themselves, then looked back to his captive and said, "Yes, Ellis? What would you like to talk about?"
"I'll tell you where they are, but you have to promise to set me free if I tell you."
"Of course, I will set you free."
"You promise?"
"On my dear mother's grave."
All right. They're in Missoula."
"Where in Missoula?"
"In a locker at the Northern Railway Station."
Still holding the bottle of honey, Oritz tilted it slightly and asked, "Does this locker have a number?"
"Yeah, locker number 7.
"And where is the key?"
"It's in my pocket. You'll have to dig me up so I can give it to you."
The honey-covered bald man struggled for a moment, as if trying to reach a hand into his pants pocket, which was highly unlikely considering the weight of earth currently surrounding him. "Gracias, amigo. I appreciate this honesty amid your current dilemma."
"Okay, now dig me up so I can give you the key."
Jesus shook his head and said, "Though the key would be a handy thing to have, I think we can do without it."
"But you promised. You said you'd set me free."
"Yes, I did, and I shall now do as you wish." Oritz continued drizzling the honey as he covered the remaining distance to the anthill.
What are you doing?"
The honey-drenched man began whipping his head back and forth, trying to wiggle out of the hole, but the more he moved, the more firmly the sandy loam settled around his body. Oritz dribbled the remaining honey across the last few feet of bare earth, between the seething mass of ants and the trail he had already poured. As the golden shower hit the insects, their anger from the burning match and cigarillo turned to ravenous hunger, and they surged along the sticky stream toward their fidgeting prize buried in the ground at the other end. In a grave voice, Oritz said, "The truth will always set you free." He moved up the slight slope toward his horse and the gang members waiting nearby. Some of the men sat on the ground in the small sliver of shade their mounts provided. Others waited impatiently in their saddles, ready to go. Jesus turned back to his captive and said, "But there is something else that will set you free."
"What?"
Ellis shrieked.
"What is it?"
Nodding his head knowingly, Jesus said, "Death."
"Oh my God, don't do this! Don't leave me here!"
Oritz climbed aboard his mount, and his men followed suit. With a nod toward his captive, Jesus said, "Vaya con Dios, amigo," then flicked the reins, turning his horse around. With a wave of his hand in the air, he signaled the waiting gang members to move out, then dug his spurs into the horse's flank. As one, they galloped west toward Missoula, without looking back. Ellis whimpered as the column of red death moved along the honey and approached his location. He could go nowhere, while the insects, on the other hand, could go everywhere. He closed his eyes and mouth as the first ant neared his face. And then they were upon him. Crawling, biting, and stinging, they seemed everywhere at once, up his nose, in his ears, and soon underneath his eyelids. After a moment, he could take no more, and he screamed briefly, until he started to gag. Like a surge inundating a drowning man, wave after wave of hungry, angry ants poured into every exposed orifice of the man's sun-reddened head. Soon Ellis was at peace, because, like Jesus had said, the truth had set him free. Chapter 3. Caleb Cantrill scrambled up the steep slope toward the top of the ridge. When he arrived on level ground again, he paused, breathing heavily, and looked back down the mountainside. Spread out at his feet, a sea of green pine and spruce intermingled with maple and birch, like patches on a pinto. A river of cobalt blue wound its way through the center of the horseshoe-shaped valley, ending in a small lake that shimmered under the summer sun. At his back, his traveling companion briefly nudged him on the shoulder, seemingly in a hurry to get going, but he ignored them. With a slight puff of breath, Caleb pushed his hat back on his head and shielded his eyes with his hand, surveying the beauty below. His keen, dark green eyes scanned in every direction as he searched for a trailing threat. There was no sign of pursuit, at least not yet. The heat was oppressive today, more like he remembered from his time in Africa and South America than what he expected here in the Dominion of Canada. He'd been all around the world, but in all the countries he'd spent any time, he'd never experienced such extremes of weather from one season to the next, not until he'd spent some time here in the West Kootenays of British Columbia. A couple of years back, in 1893, he'd traveled through this area, and it had been brutally cold that winter. Now he was here again, and it was searingly hot in the summer. There seemed no middle ground. With a shake of his head, Caleb groused, "This blasted country only seems to have 2 good months, April and October." He removed a faded bandana from around his neck, wiped the sweat from his brow and eyes, and then tugged the brown felt hat back down on his forehead. His lips felt raw, and he tasted blood from the small cracks in their surface, caused mostly by exposure to the sun rather than dehydration. Unlike spots on the prairies, he didn't want for water here. There were plenty of streams and creeks cascading down the mountainside from which to refill his canteen. And with the heat as bad as it was, he needed to remember to drink more often when he sweated as much as he did. Cantrill hoped he might finally be in the clear, at least for a little while. His mind was still a whirl from the events of the past few weeks. It was supposed to have been a career-ending heist, and it was, but not in the way he'd anticipated. Rather than ending with his retirement, it now seemed like it could end in his interment instead. And so, he'd been slogging through the backcountry of BC in an attempt to lose his entourage. It hadn't worked, and now he was looking for a hidey hole in which to plant himself for a while. Despite the setback, he hadn't gotten himself killed, captured, or arrested as of yet, so that was a good thing. Ever the eternal optimist, he thought morosely. However, all other things considered, he wasn't sure if he might have preferred either of the first 2 outcomes, rather than having to endure this seemingly endless pursuit. From what he surmised, most of the gang involved in the bank job were in one of 3 places: the hospital, the morgue, or jail. Since that was the case, he continued to think it would be best if he kept the gold all to himself, especially since he'd done the lion's share of the work getting the vault open. But, unfortunately, the rest of the gang did not see it the same way, just as he'd suspected, and they'd been relentlessly tracking his sorry ass since. After almost 3 weeks on the run, his butthole was getting awfully tender from all of this loving attention, and he needed to find a good place to stick it while things cooled off. As he'd fled west, he recalled rumors of gold in this part of the Kootenays, and it seemed like the present would be a great time for a little mining action. The last time he'd been through these parts, he'd visited the small trading post nestled in the valley's center. As he gazed down onto the distant town, which had replaced the trading post, he realized there must have been some truth to the golden hearsay after all, and he was now officially intrigued. After a quick swig from his canteen, Caleb slung it back over his shoulder. Behind him, his companion shuffled impatiently on the hot bare rock and nudged him again. With a sigh, he fished around in his trouser pockets for a moment, then pulled out a cube of sugar. He turned and held it out in his open palm. The small brown pack mule took the proffered cube gently and crushed it between its large white teeth, making quick work of the sweet treat. After a moment, it gave a small whinny and nudged his hand with its nose, looking for more. Caleb scruffed its ears and mane, then said, "Don't worry, Emily. You can have some more soon, okay?" At that, the mule quieted again. Thanks to a generous farmstead near Invermere, he'd traded his easily tracked nag the previous week for this unobtrusive mule. He'd known the mule would be a reliable beast from the moment he'd laid eyes on it. As he'd made the swap in the middle of the night, he'd figured that the downgrade from his full-sized horse to this more compact mule would be a win-win situation for both himself and the farmer. Though the nag had been getting a little long in the tooth, it had still been a relatively healthy beast, one well worth the sturdy mule for which he had traded it. Much to his surprise, he'd since formed a small bond of affection between himself and the animal. But that was to be expected.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?